Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology, and we are into the 32nd lecture today. Last time we had talked about a very prominent psychotherapist, a physician, a European doctor who left a great name for himself, a very prominent place for himself in the systems of psychology. His name was, can you recall? That's right, C.G. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, who had been educated and who practiced in Zurich. Do you know where Zurich is? Switzerland. We had covered some part of his system. I'm calling it a system, as we had called Freud's entire theory and his methodology a system, because these gentlemen developed a theoretical framework based upon their education, previous training, experience and research. Based upon all of these empirically collected data, they developed their own ways of evaluating human disease, particularly mental disease, and then developed their own system of the treatment of those diseases. And that is why we call their contributions systems. We had looked at Jung's system, and he preferred to call it analytical psychology. We had talked about some parts of his system. Before we talk about the other contributions that he made within this system, let us first review what we had seen in the past lecture related to C.G. Jung. I will give you a few seconds, I will give you 3 seconds to revise in your mind what we talked about related to Jung and his system of analytical psychology. That's right. These are your 3 seconds. We talked about, as a review, let us take a look at it. We talked about his concept of the collective and the personal unconscious. He had distinguished between 2 or some layers of the unconscious. If you remember, he disagreed with Freud on the basis that he thought that Freud had not really explained the contribution of the unconscious in determining a man's entire life, including mental disease. That was one of the reasons of his dissent, of his disagreement from Freud. So Jung gave us the theory of his, elaborately explained theory of his related to the concept of the unconscious. And he talked about, if you remember, 2 layers or 2 types of the unconscious mind. One that he called the collective unconscious, and the other that he called the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious, if you recall, was what a person, an individual represses, जो वो काबिल कबूल बात नहीं समझता एक शख्स और उसको अपने जहन से बाहर निकाल देता है, तो वही मवाद जो है युंग के ख्याल में वो उसके ज़ाती लाशऊर में चला जाता है. That material in Jung's theory that a person represses, forgets, throws out, that goes into what he calls his personal unconscious. And then there is the deeper layer which he called the collective unconscious. Or what is it that the collective unconscious contains? The collective unconscious in Jung's theory is a collection of the experiences of generations contained as archetypes in our unconscious. और दूसरी सतह जो यूंग बता रहा है हमें हमारे लाशऊर की, वो है जिसको वो कहता है इज्तमाई लाशऊर, या जिसको अंग्रेजी में वो कलेक्टिव अनकॉन्शियस कह रहा है. और इज्तमाई लाशऊर में क्या है? हमारे आबाओ अजदाद के तजुर्बात, एहसासात, आर्कीटाइप्स या नसख तमसाल की सूरत में. इसका तर्जुमा माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने आर्कीटाइप का नसख तमसाल किया है. आर्कीटाइप्स की सूरत में या नसख तमसाल की सूरत में हमारे इज्तमाई जहन में ये चीज़ें मौजूद हैं जो हमारे आबाओ अजदाद ने सदियों तक एक्सपीरियंस की हैं. और हमने यूंग की ही एक्सप्लेनेशन में बताया था आपको कि ये आर्कीटाइप्स जो हैं, there are many archetypes that Jung talks about, but we talked about 4 of them in this context. And the first one was anima, that is the female in a man. And then we talked about the animus, the male in a woman. Now remember, we are not talking about archetypes in reference to anima and animus in physical sense. We are talking about archetypes in spiritual, psychical sense. So we are not talking about, when we say anima, as if there is a woman in a man. Not at all, not that physically, but in a spiritual, psychological, psychical sense. इसी तरह से जब हम या यूंग बात करता है एनिमस की, तो उससे ये मुराद नहीं लेना चाहिए, और ना उसने ऐसा कहा है. कुछ हमारे बच्चे ये भी समझते हैं कि शायद यही वजह है कि यूंग एक शख्स को पूरी तरह से मर्द या औरत नहीं कह रहा. ऐसी बात बिल्कुल नहीं है, ये यूंग ने कभी भी नहीं कहा, तो इसको ऐसे ना समझिएगा. When Jung is talking about animus as an image, an archetype of a man in a woman, what he really means is that it is the function, the spiritual function, the psychological function of a male in a female. That is what is meant in Jung's theory of the archetype of animus. And then he talks about persona, the roles that people play, and as a result of those role playing, the mask that they wear is what he calls persona. All the masks collected together in a person are his persona. वो कभी अपनी बीवी के सामने मियाँ है, अपने दफ्तर में वो अफसर या सुपरवाइज़र या मैनेजर है, अपने बच्चों के साथ वो बाप है, अपने दोस्तों के साथ वो गपशप करने वाला हैप्पी गो लकी है. ये तमाम रोल्स वो प्ले करता है और यही उसके पर्सोना का हिस्सा हैं. These are the different masks that he wears, and that is another archetype that Jung had talked about. Then we also touched upon his theory of the archetype of the shadow, the inferior in a person, the low in a person, the bad in a person, the evil in a person, or the collection of all of these is what he calls the shadow. और भी कुछ archetypes का जिक्र करता है Jung, which are obscure, but we mentioned these 4. We also mentioned his idea of personality. He talks about 2 types of personalities. He says that human or mankind can be divided into two broad categories depending upon how their personalities function. And it talks about two types, the introverted type and the extroverted type. The introverted type, अंदरूं बीन जो है शख्सियत, वो ऐसा शख्स है जो हमें देखने वाले को, ऑब्जर्वर को ऐसा दिखाई देता है who is, जो अपनी ज़ात में गुम है, जो ज़्यादातर अपने आप अपनी कंपनी को प्रेफर करता है, जो अपने साथ रहना पसंद करता है बनिस्बत दूसरों से घुलने मिलने की. And then there is the other type that Jung talked about, which is the extrovert. The बैरून बी पर्सन जो है, the extrovert, जिसको उर्दू में हम बैरून बी कहते हैं, वो ऐसा शख्स है जो दूसरों की कंपनी को प्रेफर करता है. He is an outgoing social bird, a social animal. He loves being with people. He prefers outdoor sports and activities. And on the basis of personality types, then Jung says either a person is an introvert or he's an extrovert. Later psychologists also talk about ambiverts, जिनमें दोनों रुझानात इंट्रोवर्शन और एक्सट्रोवर्शन के मौजूद हों, उनको कुछ माहिरीन नफ्सियात एम्बीवर्ट्स भी कहते हैं. लेकिन प्रीडोमिनेंटली इन Jung's theory, the mankind can be divided into these two, the introverts and the extroverts. Jung also talked about, that we had touched upon in the last lecture, the functions of personality. You have types and then you have functions in his theory. And we talked about 4 functions of personality: the sensory function, the thinking function, emoting function, and the intuitive function. And based upon these 4 functions, we had seen that Jung's theory of personality consists of 8 types of people. Introverted, ABCD, that is sensory, thinking, intuitive, and emoting type. And extroverted, ABCD, sensing, thinking, emoting, and intuitive type. So we have 8 types of personalities. This is what we had talked about in the last lecture. Let us go forward and take a look at some of his more interesting and prominent ideas in analytical psychology. इन तमाम चीज़ों का युंग की थियोरी में एक शख्स की ज़हनी बीमारी, उसकी ज़हनी सेहत, उसके प्रोफेशन, उसकी शादी ब्याह, उसके बच्चों के साथ ताल्लुकात, उसकी दोस्तों से मिलना जुलना, गोया उसकी तमाम ज़िंदगी पे उसके कलेक्टिव अनकॉन्शियस, पर्सनल अनकॉन्शियस, पर्सनैलिटी टाइप और पर्सनैलिटी फंक्शंस का बहुत ही गहरा असर है. एंड दैट इज व्हाट इज मेंट ऑफ द सिस्टम ऑफ एनालिटिकल साइकोलॉजी. This is a theoretical framework that Jung had created to explain how human psychology manifests itself. Let us go forward of this and let us take a look at some of the other contributions that Jung made in terms of analytical psychology. One important contribution that he made was the theory of dreams. If you remember, Freud had called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. इसका क्या मतलब है? फ्रॉयड का ये ख्याल था कि ख्वाबों के ज़रिए हम लाशऊर को बड़ी अच्छी तरह से जांच, समझ और पहचान सकते हैं, और हमारे लाशऊर का, क्योंकि हमारी ज़ात पर और हमारी नफ्सियाती बीमारियों पर क्योंकि हमारे लाशऊर का गहरा असर है। इसलिए अगर हम लाशऊर को जानेंगे तो हम एक शख्स की तमाम जिंदगी के बारे में अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं। युंग का भी यही ख्याल था। युंग भी यही समझता था कि हमारी जिंदगी पे, किसी एक शख्स की जिंदगी पे उसके लाशऊर का बहुत गहरा असर है और लाशऊर का इजहार ख्वाबों के जरिए होता है। And that is why Jung developed an elaborate theory of dream interpretation. But unlike Freud, he had talked about two layers or more than one layer of the unconscious. He had talked about the personal unconscious. We just saw that, and he talked about the collective unconscious. We just saw that too. So when Jung elaborates his theory of interpretation of dreams, he is careful to point out that the interpreter must realize from which part of the unconscious the dream is expressing itself. Freud की theory में सीधा था, the unconscious expresses itself in dreams. Jung की theory में unconscious जो है उसकी layers हैं, personal भी और collective unconscious भी. तो इससे पहले कि कोई शख्स ख्वाबों की ताबीर कर पाए या समझ पाए या ख्वाबों को इस तरह से इंटरप्रेट करे कि वो एक शख्स के लाशऊर को समझने में कामयाब रहे, उसको पहले ये अच्छी तरह से मालूम होना चाहिए कि क्या ये ख्वाब ज़ाती लाशऊर की पैदावार है या इज्तमाई लाशऊर की पैदावार है. द ड्रीम इंटरप्रेटर, the psychotherapist, the person who is treating the mental disease of a person, in order for him to be able to understand the mechanisms of dream, he must realize, he must know where the dream comes from, which part of the unconscious the dream represents. Does it represent the personal unconscious? और does it represent the collective unconscious? इसको जानने का क्या जरिया है, क्या तरीका है? इसको युंग के सिस्टम में जानने का तरीका यह है that the therapist, the physician, the doctor, the interpreter must not try and interpret, must not understand a dream in isolation. A dream must be interpreted, understood in a series. A single dream is a misleading evidence that may put the therapist into a dark alley. वो उस शख्स के जिसकी वो इलाज कर रहा है या जिसके ख्वाबों की ताबीर देखने की कोशिश कर रहा है, वो उसको समझ नहीं पाएगा जब तक के ड्रीम की एक सीरीज को वो इकट्ठा ना समझे और ना देखे. उससे क्या होगा? द सीरीज ऑफ ए ड्रीम ऑफ ए पर्सन shows the evidence whether the dream is emanating, coming from the collective unconscious or the personal unconscious. The dreams coming from the collective unconscious would repeatedly show a figure, whereas the dream coming from a personal unconscious may not show those figures repeatedly. That is one little evidence. Another evidence is that certain archetypal figures, certain huge figures, certain prominent religious figures, political figures, scientists may be a part of the dream content, the dream that comes from the collective unconscious. So, in order for you as a therapist, Jung says to a trainee, you must try and interpret dreams in series rather than in single manner. Dreams also, he thought, could be providing a clue for the future. Badi interesting baat hai ye bhi. Jung distinguishes between anticipatory dreams and prophetic dreams. Those dreams that can tell the dreamer, that can give a hint to the dreamer about some future event or what plan of action should he take in future, those dreams he calls anticipatory or prophetic dreams. तो इस रेफरेंस में देखने वाली बात यह है कि युंग ये कह रहा है कि ख्वाब तो हमारे ज़ाती या इज्तमाई लाशऊर की नुमाइंदगी करते हैं, निशानदही करते हैं हमारी ख्वाहिशात की, जो हम करना चाह रहे हैं उन तमाम चीज़ों की वो नुमाइंदगी करते हैं. लेकिन इसके साथ साथ ड्रीम्स जो हैं, ख्वाब जो हैं, वो हमें तंबीह भी करते हैं हमारे मुस्तकबिल के बारे में. सो ड्रीम्स कैन बी अंडरस्टूड not only as the expression of a total personality, but based upon certain elements, variables within the dreams, the dream work can be understood, reconstructed to provide a foresight, a forward-looking view, and thereby dreams can be regarded as a warning or an anticipation of the future. ये युंग की थियरी में फ्रॉयड से काफ़ी मुख्तलिफ चीज़ है. Freud had just explained dreams in terms of expressions of the unconscious related to the person, whereas Jung relates it to the personal and the collective unconscious and considers that dreams can be viewed as anticipations about the future or what the future might hold for somebody. ये बहुत अहम चीज़ है यूंग के सिस्टम में कि जहाँ ड्रीम इंटरप्रिटेशन is considered an important element in Jungian system, the nature of dream as coming from personal or the collective unconscious, and the nature of dream in terms of anticipating or prophesying the future are important contributions that Jung has made, are prominent contributions in Jungian system. और युंग जो है वो एनालाइज कैसे कर रहा है ड्रीम्स को, समझता कैसे है, उसके ख्याल में ड्रीम्स शुड नॉट बी रिड्यूस्ड एज फ्रॉयड हैड रिड्यूस्ड, ड्रीम्स शुड बी एम्प्लीफाइड. अब ये एम्प्लीफिकेशन क्या चीज है? एम्प्लीफिकेशन ऑफ ड्रीम्स इन युंगियन पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू इज टू फाइंड पैरेलल इन द ड्रीम्स एंड फोकलोर. हमारी जो लोक कहानियां हैं एंड आर माइथोलॉजी, हमारी जो देवमाला की कहानियां हैं, हमारी से मुराद तमाम बनी नौ इंसान की, एक सेक्ट की या एक क्लास की या एक रिलीजियस सेक्शन की बात नहीं हो रही. व्हेन आई से हमारी, Jung means the entire humanity. The mythology and folklore of man provides the basis for amplification of dreams. Certain symbols that take part, that appear in dreams may also come from the folklore, may also come from various mythologies. And if those folklore figures, heroes, heroines, events, epics can be seen by the therapist and can be conveyed to the patient, that is the process of amplification. And that helps dream interpretation. Amplification is finding the meanings in dreams by referring the dream content to folklore and to mythology. This is what is meant by amplification in Jungian terminology. He also regarded an important dream work that will help a therapist and a patient to understand his dreams, and that dream work he calls symbolization. Symbolization is conveying meaning in terms of certain symbols. When power may be conveyed in the figure of a powerful man appearing in the dream, that is an example of symbolization, and the man in the dream is a symbol of power. When weakness may be conveyed as a bird or a lowly animal such as a rabbit, if rabbit is repeatedly seen, or a bird, a weak bird is repeatedly seen in a dream, Jung would regard that as a symbol of weakness, of inferiority, and convey to the person, to the patient, to the dreamer, how a bird or an animal symbolizes the weakness in him. So one of the other important elements in Jungian theory of dream interpretation, apart from amplification, is what he calls symbolization. Dream interpretation and symbolization are important ingredients of Jung's therapeutic system. He, as I said, agreed with Freud when Freud had said that dream is the royal road to the unconscious, but then he disagreed with Freud also, because Freud had said that dreams usually represents the unconscious, but Jung had said, what unconscious? Is it the personal or the collective unconscious? And then another difference between Freud and Jung about dreams was that Freud interpreted dreams, and he thought that his interpretation of dreams was the final one for the patient or the client to accept. Jung rejects that view. In psychotherapy and in his system, he rejects the view that dream interpretation should be imposed upon the patient or the protagonist. In Jungian theory, the patient or the protagonist or the client is equally important in understanding the meaning of the dream as the doctor, the physician himself. तो ये भी एक ड्रीम इंटरप्रिटेशन में उसका व्यू पॉइंट था, that apart from amplification, apart from symbolization, a consensus of interpretation of dream, consensus between the dreamer and the dream interpreter must take place. Let us go forward of Jung's system and take a look at his system of psychotherapy. Based upon his theory and his system, he developed an elaborate system of psychotherapy. पहली तो बात यह है that he rejected फ्री एसोसिएशन. आपको याद है जब हम फ्रॉइड का जिक्र कर रहे थे तो हमने आपको बताया था कि फ्रॉइड के यहाँ बताइए क्या तरीके हैं साइकोथेरेपी के. मैं आपको हिंट देता हूं कि रफली स्पीकिंग फ्रॉइडियन सिस्टम ऑफ साइकोथेरेपी और साइकोएनालिसिस was based upon 5 elements or 5 variables through which psychotherapy was carried on in Freudian psychoanalytical system. Can you recall? All right, good. 1, free association. 2, dream interpretation. 3, interpretation of everyday psychopathology of everyday life. 4, analysis of resistance. Remember? And 5, come on, analysis of transference. ये 5 तरीके फ्रॉइड ने बताए थे. आपको याद है इनका हमने एलेबोरेट जिक्र भी किया था. युंग के यहाँ जो पहली जो चीज है फ्री एसोसिएशन, he rejects it. He says free association misleads people, misleads psychotherapy. That free association should not be avoided. That the dialogue, the exchange, the communication must remain focused. Because to Jung, psychotherapy is not only healing. Listen to this carefully. Psychotherapy is not only healing, it is also helping the patient to develop. Freud ke yahan psychotherapy was relieving the patient of his symptoms and the pain and frustration that comes along with the symptoms in a mental disease. In Jung, of course, psychotherapy is relief or relieving the patient of his symptoms and frustration and pain that comes with the mental disease. But Jung goes a step further and says the therapist must help a patient to develop, to go forward in his life, to seek new heights that he can possibly achieve, to find new territories that he could conquer, to find new enemies that he could conquer. An enemy is not only in terms of a person, enemy also is in terms of ignorance. Enemy also is in terms of gaining control over certain parts of social and physical environment, which is debilitating. So in Jung's point of view, psychotherapy's aim is not only making a person symptom-free, ridding him of his symptoms. That is also a main aim and a very important one. But perhaps equally important is to show the patient the path to higher order achievement in life, ascending from his lower position to a higher position of being. And that is what the aim of psychotherapy in Jungian system is. And that is one reason why he rejected free association, because he thought that free association takes the patient and the therapist astray and does not help in showing a path to the patient to achieve higher levels of existence that is possible in view of the potential that he has. All right, what is the option that he adopts? Jung adopted a face-to-face dialogue, sitting down in front of each other and talking to each other. Direct conversation, direct communication was his method of treatment. That's one. Another was what he calls dialogue. It's not only discussion or communication, a dialogue or a discourse where one soul talks to the other soul, where one persona is not talking to the other persona, where heart to heart talk takes place. आप देखिए, इस बात को आपको समझने में ऐसे भी आसानी होगी कि हम रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में जब बातचीत करते हैं तो हम अपने ख्यालात लोगों तक तो पहुंचाते हैं, लेकिन उस बातचीत में हम अपने ख्यालात लोगों से छुपाते भी हैं. हम उनको अपनी ट्रू आइडियोलॉजी, ट्रू सच्चे ख्यालात उन तक नहीं पहुंचाते, क्योंकि मसलहतें दरपेश हैं, डर हैं, खौफ है, मुख्तलिफ चीज़ें. और युंग ने यही बात नोट की है कि साइकोथेरेपी में हार्ट टू हार्ट टॉक जो है, दिल से जो बात कहनी है और दिल से जो बात सुननी है, वही ज़रूरी है, जिसमें मसलहत का एंगल ना हो. That is what he means by dialogue. And another thing that he talks about is a full confession, to bare one's soul. पूरी तरह से अपनी रूह को बरहनगी की हालत में देखना. और ये कोई जिस्मानी लफ्ज नहीं है बरहनगी. he is talking about full confession in terms of spiritual confession. You accept, you talk about the low, the high, the good, the bad things in yourself without let or hindrance. Full confession, आपको पता है अंग्रेजी की मिसाल भी है, the truth shall release you. अगर आप सच बोलें तो आप हर तरह से अपने आप को आज़ाद महसूस करते हैं. And that is what Jung is talking about when he's talking about a full confession in psychotherapy. So psychotherapy in Jung's point of view is dream interpretation. Psychotherapy in Jung's point of view is a full confession. Psychotherapy in Jung's point of view is a dialogue, a debate and a discussion. Jung does not regard neurosis purely as a negative expression of personality. एक और interesting बात, Jung talks about neurosis as having a positive side also. Up to this point, up to Freud, and we had talked about in detail about mental disease in the history of mental disease, and it appeared that mental disease was considered to be only a negative expression, manifestation of the personality. Jung agrees with that point of view. It is a negative expression of personality. But also at the same time, Jung presents a slightly divergent view to the traditional view related to mental illness. And that is that neurosis has a positive side also. And what is that positive side? Neurosis is a sign, a symbol where a person has failed to realize his full potential of life. A person, for instance, who is suffering from anxiety, that anxiety is of course an expression of negativity, but also that anxiety underneath shows him, is pointing towards the fact that he has potential, that he has limited time, and that potential has to be fulfilled within that limited time, and that is why, in Jungian point of view, he is feeling anxious. So anxiety, which is negative, a mental symptom, is also a positive pointer towards realizing the full potential of personality. Jung also talks about the role of religion in life and particularly in neurosis. Religion must not be understood in the conventional mazhabi sense. In Jung's analytical system, religion, when he talks about religion, he doesn't mean necessarily Buddhism, Christianity, Sikhism, Hinduism, Muslim, Judaism, Islam. He's not referring to religion in these terms, but he is referring to religion in terms of the attitude of a person. And the attitude of a person expresses itself in dogma and in belief. Jung says that religion must be understood as two things, basically. Of course, there are hundreds of things that he says are related to religion, but two things mainly. Number one, the practice, and number two, the philosophy. The stronger the belief, the stronger the person. The more dominant role religion plays in a person's life. But some people, in Jung's point of view, prefer the dogma, the practice of it. And thereby he considers that they forget the belief part of it. When the belief, जिसको Jung मजहब की रूह समझता है, जब Jung की ख्याल में कोई शख्स उस रूह को नज़रअंदाज करे और सिर्फ प्रैक्टिस पर जोर दे, तो उसके ख्याल में ये उस शख्स की एक कोहता नजरी है. और यही Jung का पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है, जिसके बारे जो उसने रिलीजन के बारे में बयान किया है. इसमें एक बात बतानी ये भी मुनासिब रहेगी कि 20वीं सदी का ये पहला माहिर नफ्सियात है जिसने मजहब की अहमियत को समझा और उसको अपने सिस्टम में जगह दी और उसका तज्जिया करके इसको एक शख्स की जिंदगी के लिए खुशगवार बनाने का रास्ता, जिंदगी को खुशगवार बनाने का रास्ता इसने दिखाया. आप जानते हैं फ्रॉइड ने भी रिलीजन के बारे में काफी लिखा, लेकिन जो नुक्ता नजर युंग ने रिलीजन के बारे में अपनाया वो पॉजिटिव नुक्ता नजर है. इसलिए ये वो पहला माहिर नफ्सियात है 20वीं सदी में जिसने मजहब के रोल को जांच के, सोच समझ के अपने मरीजों की फलाह व बहबूद के लिए मुनासिब तरह से उनको बताया कि इसका समझना और इसको प्रैक्टिस करना उनके लिए कितना खुश आइंद और खुशगवार होगा. तो युंग की एक कंट्रीब्यूशन ये भी है, द रोल ऑफ रिलीजन इन सिस्टम. और इससे पहले कि हम ख़त्म करें, एक और आखिरी बात युंग के बारे में मैं बता दूं कि जब हम ये जिक्र करते हैं युंग के रेफरेंस में that he distinguishes between a symptom-less person and a mentally healthy person, he is talking about two different types. When we were talking about his system of therapy, we said that he had put forward the view that therapy is not only making a person symptom-free, but also putting him in the right direction to develop his true potential. Development of true potential and achievement of true potential he calls individuation. जैसा कि आप स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे होंगे. Individuation is when a person can realize the true potential that nature has put into him. If he was made to be a scientist, then he is a top-class scientist. If he was made to be a playwright, then he has become a top-class playwright, or is at least in the direction of becoming a top-class playwright. So individuation is the achievement of a state of being which represents the true potential's fulfillment. And that is what Jung says should be and is the aim of psychotherapy. The aim of psychotherapy is not only treatment of symptoms, it is a treatment of symptoms also, but it is also individuation, getting the patient to realize, to achieve the true potential. Before we end today's lecture, let us take a look at what we had talked about in reference to Jung. We talked about a number of things today about Jung, and that the first thing was that his system is called analytical psychology, that he gave us the interpretation, the theory of interpretation of dreams. We had already talked about his personality theory. We had already talked about his collective and personal unconscious, and we had talked about what is contained in those. Today we talked about his theory of dream interpretation. And dream interpretation, he says, has to be undertaken in view of whether the dream represents the personal or the collective unconscious. And that is what he talked about. In terms of dream interpretation, we know that he talked about dreams should be interpreted in series. That will help us to understand whether they come from the personal or the collective unconscious. That dreams must be understood also as anticipatory or prophetic dreams. That the dreams that come from the collective unconscious must be amplified, must be understood in terms of amplification. And amplification is finding parallels in the dream content and folklore and mythology. Jung also talks about his system of psychotherapy. His system of psychotherapy is not only healing, but helping a person to develop what? Into a person that God himself had created him to become. In other words, to be able to realize his true potential. His system of, his methodology, his technology of psychotherapy was, he rejected free association, he adopted discussion and dialogue and what he called a full confession. A full confession is when the patient bears his soul, something that he even hides from himself. मैं अपनी तमाम कोताहियां अपने से छुपाए रखता हूँ. मैंने जो एक शख्स ने जो अपनी जिंदगी में मामूली या बड़े गुनाह किए हैं, वो उनको याद करना, उनको अपने जहन में रखना, शऊर में लाना पसंद नहीं करता. और ये यूं के ख्याल में फुल कन्फेशन नहीं है. फुल कन्फेशन वही है कि वो शख्स अपनी तमाम कोताहियों को और तमाम कमतरियों को और तमाम inferiorities और infirmities को accept करे, and that acceptance comes only by a full confession. That is one part of his technology of treatment. Of course, interpretation of dreams is another, and then dialogue is another. And then, as last thing that we talked about, that he stressed the importance of religion in one's daily life. And he showed how a misunderstanding of religion might be problematic and how that may be avoided. And then lastly, he talks about the process or the achievement of individuation. Individuation is a stage or a state in life where a person has been able to achieve the full potential that God had created in him. That is Jung's system. He was one of the prominent followers of Freud who developed his own theory and system. We will talk about another one of Freud's prominent follower, and that would be Alfred Adler. Until that time, do take a look at what we have covered so far, and if it's possible, do take a look at Alfred Adler also. Until that time, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.